Okay, fab. Well, thank you so much for joining. So I'm Bethan. So I work at Sikh Human Rights Group. So we're an NGO with special consultative status at the UN, which we got in 2015, and we've been around since about 1984. So my job is as a human rights communication and media officer. And just this year, I started kind of our female empowerment series with a few of my colleagues. And we're speaking about loads of different areas within that series. So we talk a lot about kind of the importance of female representation, intersectional feminism. And what we've recently started doing as well is talking about the need for better education on female reproductive health. So what we've started, which is the first one, is that we're going to host monthly webinars as a part of our series on female reproductive health. So where we'll talk to experts in the field on periods, contraception, miscarriage, conceiving, pregnancy, postpartum depression, parenting, menopause, and hopefully some more as well. And hopefully some in-person ones. And what we're working towards in March is hosting a side event at the UN. So it's the 66th session on the Commission on the Status of Women. And the focus that year is talking about female empowerment within climate change. So what we're trying to do, and what we'll kind of talk about a little bit in this webinar, is actually to try and highlight how we need better education on sustainable period products. And actually the title will be allowing those who menstruate to be environmentally conscious throughout the entire month. So we'll go into that a little bit further, but that's kind of what we're doing with this as well. So we want to try and use a lot of feedback and hear kind of what everyone has to say. So I'm sure everyone knows that the webinar is all about periods today, which is our favourite. So what we're going to do is not just educate you obviously on that. I'm sure everyone kind of is aware of what they are, but actually talk about why education is so critical for everyone, and it's critical for female empowerment, that everyone understands kind of the female reproductive health. So we'll kind of talk about loads of things and they'll cross over a little bit, but we'll talk about the dangers of lack of education. So this is where kind of the work Binti Period will come in, especially in the Gambia at the moment. Talk about gaslighting and what occurs when the lack of education, the lack of exposure to periods, and how then that can lead to things like endometriosis, taking up to 8 to 12 years to be diagnosed, and 1 in 10 women will have it. So the gaslighting of kind of, not believing when people's periods are really bad, but also where that leads as well is normalizing the not normal. So looking at how our menstrual cycle is kind of an insight into our health. So then if we have really bad period pains, that should be kind of a way that we're told something's going wrong, but actually because it's been so normalized. And actually one of the kind of cures is effectively put, young girls from about 13 on the pill. We can kind of have this really undiagnosed for a long time, and actually can lead to infertility. And then again, talk a little bit more about kind of the sustainable products that we can use as well. But also recognize this is a very short webinar for so much that we can cover. So there is obviously topics surrounding kind of the lack of hygiene with periods and kind of the facilities that we have in the UK as well, but also talk about kind of non-binary, transgender perspective. So if that's something that people want to bring up at any point, then I will open the floor at the end and we can discuss it if we do have time. But anyway, I'll introduce you to who you're kind of here for. So this is Manjit, who I will kind of, if you want to pin, to give her a wave, she's got the cool glasses on. So Manjit Gill is, before creating Binti Period, she has had 20 years of business enterprise experience. And her role as a mentor for business women in Kenya with the Cherry Blair Foundation led to her starting this project. So her mission is to create a huge social impact whilst generating a sustainable organization. And as a British Indian, providing basic menstrual rights for women in India has become her overarching commitment to make a change. She was also awarded with an MBE in 2020 for the Queen's Birthday Honours List for her work in the provision of period products to the women around the world. And she's also a trustee in the Global Sikh Economic Forum. She is an ambassador for the Blair Foundation and Women of the Future. So very impressive women. Binti Period, so their kind of mental is that they believe that every female deserves menstrual dignity, meaning access to education about menstruation, access to pads, and freedom of stigma and taboos surrounding menstruation. They are the first period charity in the UK, and they are registered in India, in the US and the Gambia now. They also lead the government's period task force, and with that they remit to end stigma and taboo and work on period education as a charity. So I'll stop talking and pass over to Manjip to introduce herself a lot better than I have, I'm sure. I think you might be on mute if you want to unmute yourself. When you're ready. There you go.
Hi, thank you, Beth, and that was a lovely introduction. And I haven't actually done a Zoom, I think, for nearly 6 months because of all the traveling, but I will give it my best shot. It's nice to see the friendly faces. I'll be able to tell whether I'm saying things that people relate to, or whether it's something that you're not sure of or you haven't heard before. But essentially, like Bethan said, we were the first period charity in the UK. We've been running for about 8 years now. And our vision is to create a world where all women have menstrual dignity. And it's an interesting one because I think there's so many things that we could talk about when we start discussing menstruation, and we could, I know that I could talk for hours, but to simplify what we're trying to achieve today, I'm going to focus a little bit more on the stigma and the taboo, and also the work that we've been doing in the education side of things. And essentially, our education program started about 8 years ago. We went on a trip to Nairobi, interviewed about 100 girls on the ground, and the stories were horrific, from some telling me that they sold themselves, others using cow dung, animal skin, sitting on a hole for a week, and lots of other things. And I guess to get a broader perspective, we went to India. And when we interviewed the girls in India, what we found was that the only thing that they related to was the fact that if you asked them what a period was, they could only tell you that it was dirty. They couldn't tell you why they bled or how to take care of themselves, or in fact, even how to, or where the blood came from. So when we started our education program, when we started putting it together, we started right from the basic idea. Because one thing that I think we forget is that if girls will start bleeding from age 7 around the world, and they will bleed for every month for 4 decades of their lives, and they're expected to learn on the job. And we know that the stigma and the shame comes from this idea that when a girl starts her period, she could have sex and then she would have a baby. So what we've done is, in fact, we've taken away reproduction from our menstrual health education. So we don't say to girls, if the egg has not been fertilized, then your period will start. We just talk about menstruation on its own as a standalone topic. And we bring reproduction into our training or our education classes much later, maybe when the child is about 13 or 14. And we also talk about puberty for girls and boys, because what we found is, while we're teaching the girls and the boys around menstruation, we haven't really discussed the puberty that boys go through. And it's really interesting. I've learned so much over the last few years and understand my son so much better now as a consequence of talking to boys from around the world. So what are we doing in the Gambia? We are actually launching our menstrual education across the country. In our first phase, we're going to be training one teacher from each school across the country. And then our second phase will be evaluating how the training is going. And thirdly, we'll be launching a low-cost product in the country for women and girls to access period products. And one of the interesting things, of course, is sometimes, as Beth mentioned right at the beginning, is that this shame and stigma isn't something that just exists in places like India or across Africa. In the UK, we still shove products up our sleeves. Well, if we were in the office, and before COVID, we were still shoving them up our sleeves, right? What we also know is that most women in the UK will use toilet paper in between buying period products, because we don't always have a period product in our handbag. And not all public spaces have access to period products. So we, in fact, worked with Surrey County Council this year, and they became the first county in the country to provide free period products in all of their buildings, which are about 58 across the county. So change since we first started has definitely happened. And is it happening fast enough? I'm not sure. I think we have an issue, I would say, today where we've got hundreds and thousands of different organizations popping up, talking about periods. There isn't like a standard understanding across the board. So, for example, we don't use the word hygiene. We don't use the word sanitary, because those are the things, again, that suggest that periods are dirty. So we're revamping all the language that we use around it. Even periods itself is a word that isn't actually factual, right? Periods is another way of saying menstruation, periodically, but we've got accustomed to using the wrong language. And in the Gambia, what we found was that through the years, because the community is using different language, let me start that again. So there's several languages in the Gambia, and the two main languages, they don't actually know what the correct word for menstruation is, because the community is so used to using code words for periods. And over the years, they've actually lost the word. So we're trying to find the word in different African languages so that we can use the correct one. And for now, they're having to use menstruation, our teachers at least. So it's really interesting. It's interesting in the sense that, as Beth said, that periods are the most normal process that a female may go through. And what we find is, because we're not taught about menstruation, even in the UK, despite having sex education, we don't know enough for us to manage our bodies moving forward and throughout our lives. And that's why things like health or having babies is something that will come up much later in life as an issue and a problem. If we knew that we were on our menstruation every day of our life, then perhaps we could consider where we are in our cycle, so that we know what to eat, when to rest, and manage our cycle much better. It's only through the work that I've been doing that I realized that once a month, when I thought my life was really miserable and I couldn't understand why I was feeling so depressed, and then the next day my period would start, if we were able to teach children to manage their cycles and chart their cycles right from the beginning, then less of that would happen. We would be able to manage our emotions better. So menstrual health in the UK in schools, it's still part of sex ed. And if you remember when you had sex ed, we kind of did this, where we saw the penis and or a man and a woman having sex, for example. And I think that's kind of the issue that we have, that we say that, well, we have sex education in the UK. We say that we don't have shame in the UK. 1 in 3 girls cannot afford or cannot access period products was the most recent stat for the UK. So it's not something that just happens in places, far off places. It's happening on our doorstep. And I don't think any of this would have been uncovered had it not been for the work that we and a number of other organizations have started. So there's definitely a lot of change. There's a lot of more open discussion around periods. We know that Scotland became the first country last year to provide free period products to anybody that needs them. So change is definitely happening. Beth, did you want to ask some of those questions, or which way would you like me to head?
Yeah, well, I also want to kind of open the floor. So if anyone does have questions around kind of what Manjot is saying, then please do kind of either pop your hand up or pop them in the group chat, as it were. But I think as well, you kind of touched on it, but obviously one thing like you said, we aren't taught, and this is in the UK, so this, you can imagine, is universal in so many countries, that periods are an insight into your health. From if you are missing your periods, which a lot of young girls do, if they are under eating or over exercising, or period pains are quite severe. Again, I think there's this idea that it's so normal. I think people kind of say, as if they're on their periods, it's kind of like, no one really talks about kind of the severe pain they're having. So obviously things like I said, in endometriosis and other diseases will go kind of years and years before they're actually diagnosed, because again, we put on these kind of other pills or something else, which again, nothing to knock the birth control pill, but obviously that's not what it should be there for, is to disguise any other issue. It's it kind of is almost taking away the responsibility of maybe healthcare to talk about, okay, let's actually spend a bit more money into looking at the research into endometriosis, which I don't know if kind of in your work then with in the Gambia and India, etc. as well, have you noticed that there are a lot of young girls or women kind of who have got these underlying health issues they didn't realize they had, because they're just not talking about this thing that happens to them once a month and means that they can't go to school, you know, potentially an entire week of their of an entire month they're missing school each week.
Yeah, I would say so. I mean, I'll cover a couple of the points that you made, but the first one is, yes, you're absolutely right. Menstruation is actually, I consider, the fifth vital sign of health. And in fact, if I had a car accident and I was in hospital, the first thing they'd probably ask me is, once they got through the pain and everything, would be, well, when was your last period? Anytime we go to hospital, they will always ask you about your cycle, because it kind of gives them a good overview of where you are. But also, to highlight the lack is that most GPs only get 15 minutes of menstrual education through their training. And that's why there's such a big difference in understanding or even recognizing what a normal period is. And if you don't recognize, if you're having problems with the period and the first thing they do is put you on the pill, that just exasperates the issue, because we're so disconnected from our cycle already. And this one takes it away further. And when I say disconnect, for example, we live in a society where we kind of use disposable pads. So we have a disposable pad. We've got no idea how much we bleed every month. We see a used pad. We kind of put it in the plastic and we throw it away. So we don't know how much we bleed. The second thing is, of course, is that if we were to use a reusable pad, for example, what we'll find is we'll have a better understanding of how much blood we're actually losing during our cycle. When you wash your pad, you get in touch with that liquid, and it almost takes away that stigma and the shame from it, because you're now in tune with your body. The other thing is we don't even know what a vulva is versus a vagina, right? We could all draw a penis, but how many of us actually could draw the female reproductive organs? So going back to understanding what a normal cycle is, it's something that I would say comes up whenever we teach anywhere in the world. Once we're going through teaching the children about marking the calendar so that they understand where they are in their cycle, we will always have questions at the end where someone will say, well, I've been bleeding for 14 days. Is that normal? Or someone will say, I only bleed 1 day every 3 months. And imagine that these are children, girls or children in school that have quietly been dealing with their menstruation without understanding it, and they have no idea what is normal. And when we go to places across Africa, then obviously the other issue that we always have is that because health facilities are so rare and unaffordable for most, we'll get a lot of questions about other things related to health. So, for example, someone might say that it sounds like they've got thrush, but they're not sure what it is, so they'll just think that period blood is dirty, or menstruation is something that's not clean, because if they're not changing their products regularly, then that makes them feel that there's something dirty about it. And there's so many things that we hear in terms of the shame and the stigma and where it comes from. So, for example, some people in the Gambia will wash their disposable pad before they throw it away. And the reason they do that is because somebody might use their blood for black magic purposes. So when we go into different areas, understanding the shame and the stigma and the taboo that exists is paramount to being able to change the way that they think about periods. So when we train our teachers, the first thing we do is we have to eradicate their own stigma and shame. And the reason for that is you can't teach periods unless you are completely comfortable and open and you don't have any stigma and shame of your own. Otherwise, you just keep giving it out to the children or the people that you're teaching. So again, lots of things that I've said there, and like I said, I could carry on quite a lot, but I'm going to keep stopping to make sure we answer questions as we're moving along.
Yeah, like I said, do reach out if you've got any questions. I suppose as well, one question would be is, what work have you had to do with then the education or the legal system in the Gambia and maybe elsewhere as well? Have you kind of noticed there are, I guess, obstacles in your place that you think, okay, this isn't actually a part of any form of curriculum, so is it legally that you have to implement it, or is it that you have to speak to kind of the government and just say this needs to change? Like, how do you start going to a country and say this actually needs to change? Like, where's the start point for that?
Well, the start point was always going into the schools and understanding what they know about menstruation right now, and when we say what they know, but also understanding the stigma and the shame that they believe in, or the stigma and taboo that they believe in, and how that creates the shame. And when we were in the Gambia, what we knew was that although they have a certain element of sex education within their curriculum already, the teachers aren't equipped to educate using that curriculum. So what we've done is we've broken it down to really basic, fundamental topics through menstruation. So the first one is something like understanding puberty. What are the puberty changes that a boy will go through? What are the changes that a girl will go through? We look at stigma and taboo as a standalone topic. So in the Gambia, there's a high number of polygamy, for example. So there's polygamy, there's FGM. It's also a Muslim country. So we have to be aware of the cultural and the religious differences. And what I've learned by teaching this in my own community is that when I first started, I guess I was quite horrified that there were temples in India where girls were not allowed to go into if they were on their period. But then when I started having conversations in our own places of worship within the Sikh community, what I found was that not all Sikh women are allowed to do all service in Sikh temples or Gurdwara, because there's such a vast array of beliefs and stigma across the community. It's always difficult to work out which rule applies where. So I started by looking at our own community. We signed up the Khalsa Jatha Gurdwara, which is the oldest Sikh temple in the UK. We signed a policy with them. And when we signed the policy with them, we went through different hurdles where some women in the community didn't think it was appropriate for us to talk about menstruation. Others didn't think that there was a lack of period products available for the community. And then I guess the third one really was just that they were quite shocked and horrified about having that discussion around periods. And I guess it kind of reflected some of the feelings that I went through with my mother, who, when I went and did the research in India, she actually heard, because I recorded the videos of different conversations with girls who talked about the fact that they didn't have access and they may have used a rag, or some who bled because they were working in the mountains and herding animals. And when she saw the videos, rather than, I guess it was her initial shock, she saw the video, she grabbed the phone and she kind of chucked it across the bed and she said, "Why do you have to do such a dirty job?" And I realized that she was shocked by what she'd heard, but she didn't really want to hear about it either, if that makes sense. And then I think it was a few weeks later, I was due to go onto the Sikh channel and talk about menstruation and the work that we did. And I went to my mother's house the day before, and she said, and I was wearing a onesie, and I didn't realize that we were going to have visitors and guests around. So she was horrified by what I was wearing when I went to her house. And if you're Indian, you really get that, but otherwise it's a little bit difficult to explain the distaste that our parents have when we don't dress appropriately. But anyway, I went to my mum's and she said to me, "Make sure when you go on television tomorrow that you don't speak to the white bearded man, and that you speak to the female young presenter," because she was so worried that the community might say, "What's your daughter doing on television talking about menstruation?" And then this really funny thing happened, because this old white bearded man said, well done, Manjit, this is really important work. It's really what we need in our community, and thank you. And I remember the next day, my mother, when I saw her, she was less aggravated by what she perceived as something that shouldn't be discussed. And I think through the years, actually this week, I took her to collect my MBE, and it's almost like she's gone through a journey of change, but it's also a reflection of how our communities work. When somebody in the community that we respect talks about something that has stigma or taboo attached to it, it really helps you to let go of your fears and you believe them. It's a hard one, right? I guess there's ways that we could interpret it in the UK as well. So if you have a celebrity that you really admire, are you going to go and buy one of their expensive football boots or football shoes just because they're wearing it? It's that kind of ideology, I suppose. And again, I've said so much, so I'm going to stop and see if there's any questions or.
No, that was great. Thank you. I don't know if Ria, you had anything you wanted to say.
Yes, I did. Hi, it's lovely to meet you. I just had the question. So obviously we were talking about the cultural stigma and attitudes towards periods. And, you said you've done a lot of work in the Gambia and in India as well. So I was just wondering whether colonization has affected, the cultural stigma that is now attached to female reproductive health at all. Because obviously we always see it from a cultural point of view. So I was just wondering if there was any difference after, because of colonization.
It's a great question, and I guess when you look deeper into stigma and taboo, it could stem from it stems from many places, but from my own understanding, I would say that what I know about communities at large is that I guess we haven't done enough research to tell you whether that existed before colonization or whether it came after. But some of those, some of the patterns are very similar, right? So for example, if you speak to somebody in India, and I think this is my belief as well, and you ask them if they have experience or something, they'll always say yes, yes, yes. And that yes, 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 I believe comes from that time where they were just told they couldn't do anything other than say yes, right? They had to be obedient. And whether that relates back into other areas where if you ask them if they've got any problems, they'll always say, no, I'm fine. And we don't talk about things. So from that perspective, perhaps, but I would say that I don't know it deep enough to tell you whether that affects or not.
Great, thank you. Yeah, like I said, if anyone's got any questions, to pop them in the chat or pop your hand up. With that kind of being said as well, you kind of obviously spoke about how you've noticed a bit of a generational difference, and I think that that's maybe something that I've kind of noticed that is become more common now, at least within friends or whatever, that to talk to female friends, you feel quite comfortable talking about your own period or your kind of own experience with it. It's quite a comfortable zone because you know that that's something they're going through, and you know your friends. But I do think, and this isn't to be put on men, but it's this idea that once a male has entered the conversation, that's when you stop the conversation because you think they can't hear about this. It's like this doesn't actually happen, and this is something that some of the work we're doing is actually looking at these lingerie brands effectively, and how for instance Victoria's Secret's, whether that's to change their brand or not, but one of the things they've done is actually to start selling period panties. So pants that you can have your period in, and it's more sustainable. And so what we're looking into is other kind of leading lingerie brands, and if they're doing the same. And actually, a lot of the lingerie they sell is so far removed from being anything comfortable to wear if you're on your period, and actually looking at, okay, for the male gaze, this is very much the underwear that you'd wear to disguise you're not on your period. This doesn't happen, but once you are, you can't use that underwear because it's not seen as sexy, or it's not seen as kind of feminine or whatever, which is interesting because obviously having a period is a very feminine thing. But I kind of, with your experience then bringing in kind of education and stuff, at what point do you see this discipline being taught? Is it at school level where you think, okay, we're going to divide the class that only girls learn about periods and boys don't? which obviously brings in a load of issues in terms of then people who, you know, are non-binary or kind of transgender at that point, they kind of haven't learned about it, etc. But yeah, where do you kind of notice that difference? At what age is that kind of implemented? Or at least in the UK, obviously it might be different elsewhere.
So again, you've covered a few points. I'm going to go with a couple of them to start with. When we talk about periods, say in the workplace or having that conversation in a boardroom, how we handle it is we talk about it differently. So we're not going to talk necessarily about the blood clot and I'm sorry if there's anyone, I'm sure everyone here is fine with that, but the blood clot or the pain or how much blood comes out, or talking about the pain of breasts. We don't talk so much about that as we would perhaps about the sustainability of a product or the amount lost in time and money for employees if we were talking about putting period products in the workplace. And it's surprising because we think sometimes that men are not open to that discussion, but most men are quite understanding of the fact that there is a lack or is something that isn't discussed. And mostly I would say that because perhaps there is still that slight shame there. They just want to get the conversation over and done with. They agree with everything that we say and we move forward. There are on occasion, for example, I remember I was meeting Prince Charles and Prince Charles asked, what work do you do? And I said, oh, we're a charity that works in menstrual health. And he said, oh, mental health, that's really important in our world and society today. And I didn't have enough time to correct him or even know what language I could perhaps use to hone in on the topic a little bit more. But then at the same time, we've spoken to politicians and they get it straight away, because I guess they're a little bit more in tune with the fact that we need to have these conversations so that we can look at who doesn't have access and affordability and things like that. Last week we were in Slough and we were teaching sixth formers about menstruation, and it was a mixture of girls and boys, and it was the first time we'd visited the school. And what we found was that actually there wasn't one child in the class, or I think there was about 50 kids there. There wasn't one child that could actually explain the biology of a period. And most of the girls had already started menstruating. And the boys were a little bit more open talking about periods than the girls were. The girls, in fact, we really had to work them hard to let go of their shame so that they could then share their period stories towards the end of the session. So I'm a firm believer that menstrual education should be taught to the girls and boys separately to start with, and then together later as we go through the process, because that allows for girls just to open up sooner and share all the questions that they might have around understanding their cycle personally. But at the same time, we do need to teach the girls and the boys together about their puberty so that they can really understand what each of them are going through. And in fact, sometimes it's not that different, because it's crazy, right? We go through menstruation at that time in our life where we're embarrassed about everything. We're embarrassed about our parents, our friends, what we might wear, how we look, everything. And then we have menstruation on top. So it's just the worst time, I think. But also the boys, it seems, in this generation, they're a lot more open to the idea of talking about periods if they are not embarrassed about it to start with. So if we were to start having that discussion much younger in their lives, they're going to find it a lot more normal than when they learn about it later. And I think it's the same for girls. When the girls understand that the boys are going through their own shame and their own puberty, because do we really know that when a boy has a wet dream for the first time, how difficult that might be for him, or how embarrassing it might be? He might wet a bed sheet, for example, and who's going to pick up his bed sheet? So they go through similar things. It's just obviously on a very different scale. And finding a pad, a bloody pad or a bloody tampon, how do they deal with that? What do they go through, and how do they eradicate that shame from the beginning so that it doesn't affect them going through their lives? So yeah, even culturally, when we work in places like India and the Gambia, the boys, they have so many questions around periods, and once they start understanding how it works. I think most of them are really happy that they are able then to support their friends or the girls in their lives. Boys will always ask us things like, can the girl hold her period in? And in fact, actually, last week, one of the girls said, Miss, is it true that we can hold our period in? And I kind of crossed my legs and said, yeah, momentarily, perhaps, if you've just started and you want to walk to the toilet, but not really. So it's those little questions. Imagine that they have to, it might take them years, and they've been bleeding every month or every cycle for them to understand that what is normal and what isn't. And then we talked about the period products again, and I think you said that in terms of sustainability, you know, the worst thing I guess in our sector is that Procter & Gamble can provide period products and education to schools. I mean, imagine if one of the pharmaceutical companies was allowed to teach children about paracetamol, for example. It's quite shocking, isn't it? Because what we know happens is once you start using a product, you might actually use that product for most of your life. If you're using an always pad, you might stick with always for the rest of your life. So I think it's wrong that manufacturers are able to get in front of children and teach them about their products. And in fact, we should teach them about menstrual cups and period underwear and reusable products and organic tampons. And another thing that came up last week was, Miss, how many period products do they use in a day? They've got no idea. They don't know if you use. They have never even touched a pad or a tampon, and we let them experience holding one. And one of the boys last week refused to touch one. And when he finally got the courage to actually hold it, we know that he's gone through a process of not feeling so ashamed anymore. So those processes that we put the kids through during their education, it is a process of tearing down the layers of shame and stigma and getting to the point where, okay, this isn't that bad. It's quite normal. The girls have told us some of their period stories. Oh my God, I didn't know that she suffered so badly with her period and why she gets angry or upset. So it really kind of, I think the next generation or the generation that goes through menstrual education will just be this generation that are a lot more empathetic with each other's health issues and also more understanding and maybe more aware of what their own bodies are going through, and teaching girls to look at their vulva and vagina area by using a mirror. I mean, I don't think I did one until maybe 3 or 4 years ago, and that's quite shocking. That's just something that we don't do because we're told right from the beginning, don't look down there. And I think last week we also found out that we asked the children to tell us what words they had for penis, for example, or vagina. And this is it was a Sikh school, and the kids said they know that they were called pee-pees and wee-wees and shishis, but when we asked the girls couldn't come up with a word that they were told was used for their vagina or the vulva area. And again, it was one of those things. Why is it that we talk about the boys' parts, but we don't talk about the girls' parts? So I'll leave you with some more questions if you have any there.
No, that was great. Thank you. Yeah, I think I found it really interesting and scary as well that, you know, that you said before that girls as young as 7 can actually start their period, and how a lot of it is actually becoming more common because of, again, obesity is rising. So again, these kind of effectively the fat on your body is then releasing the estrogen, I believe, to then to start your period a lot earlier than maybe kind of a lot of other people would have had. And so I think that, you know, from what I remember at school, I learned it when I was leaving primary school. So that's when you're 11, 12. And I remember one person at that time was kind of going through it, and I thought that was crazy. I thought that I didn't think she would survive. But I just think that it is really interesting that actually, yeah, this is something that maybe it has changed slightly, but it is something that needs to be spoken about from a very early age. And I've listened to a lot of podcasts about kind of mums who are in this field, I'm not sure if you'd be the same as well, but they obviously just have this conversation very openly from their child on the get-go, and actually just like it's just a part of life. It's something so natural, and that's something that like hopefully in the future webinars we'll talk about in terms of the menopause, etc. And actually just these conversations about any stage of kind of the female health effectively is such an important conversation to have, because we need to know what's normal and what's not normal. And I think, you know, learning about how your period affects you, and I think that's where I found it is most important and quite frustrating, because you learn a lot about yourself as well, is that, you know, your to-do list effectively changes every week, and the week before your period it might be a lot shorter than, you know, the week after, where you're like, okay, I can do a lot of stuff. So it is something that I think you know, when you're younger, you're kind of, especially at uni and stuff, you're trying to get all these deadlines in, and actually you kind of have to be a little bit easier on yourself. But that is an element of understanding, okay, this is why actually I'm so much more tired these few days or these few weeks. But with the kind of products then you use in the Gambia, for instance, I know a lot of it, you kind of push for the sustainability side of it. And obviously I think this is, you know, an issue in the UK, is that, again, it's almost this, although it happens every month, it's like a quick fix of like, just grab whatever easiest, whichever's cheapest, etc., and deal with it, rather than, okay, like you said, educating on actually, okay, how do we use a moon cup? Kind of, it doesn't have to be this terrifying experience. If that doesn't work for you, these are the other options as well. And understanding that, you know, the plastic in these products take 500 years to decompose. They're really bad for the environment. And, you know, to be a part of like this female empowerment, you actually want to consciously be beneficial to the environment all the time, rather than have to like stop for a week. And the same with, again, it's recently come out that the cotton used in a lot of the products, or at least a lot of the mainstream products, are collected by cotton pickers, the Uyghurs in Xinjiang in China, which is obviously kind of where the genocide is happening. And I think that, you know, that's horrific to know as a supplier, as a consumer rather, you aren't aware that this is the kind of product you're using, and it's just being sold kind of globally. So what's kind of your position in the UK then on just better education that has to happen on making sure that we are aware of these sustainable products to young girls and making them more accessible?
Well, actually, last week, as I was speaking to the head of the school, we were talking about a menstrual cup, and one of the male teachers asked how a menstrual cup was used, and I said, well, if you insert it like you would a tampon, but you can leave it in for up to 12 hours. And the head, she said, oh, but that must be really difficult if somebody needs to have a wee. So this simple idea of understanding how many holes we have down there, it's not that clearly understood, and it's crazy. And I think even with the teachers in the Gambia, going back to language, we decided, or I said, as adults, I'm going to use the word vagina, and I'm going to use the word vulva and penis, because we needed to get that language out there right from the beginning. It's as normal as calling my finger a finger, right? And the reason why I'm talking about that first is because that's what you mentioned right at the onset. But just this, the only way we can normalize conversations is if we really use the correct language right from the beginning. And I know that when young kids, when they first see a pad, and they might think it's a nappy for a while, and you let them, and you give them information as they're growing as a child, so that they understand with their vocabulary. So going on to sustainable products, it's the simple things. Every single period product I've ever used in my life is still sitting on the planet. I have my own period mountain. We all have our own period mountains, and they are still sitting on the planet. And when you start thinking about the impact that we have on our planet personally, then we can start looking at how responsible we feel about it. Because essentially, reusable products are not always affordable for everyone, right? They might cost a little bit more than, say, a disposable one, but then the disposable one might be more convenient, and of course it's worse for the planet. So in places like India, when we first started, I was working with this chap who was responsible for cleaning the river Ganges. And I remember at an event, he said to me, Manjit, if only 12% of women have access to period products in India, and you increase that to, say, 14% or 15%, what are you going to do with the fact that there's going to be so many more period products that are swimming in the rivers or being thrown in the roads. And I remember at that time getting really quite annoyed with him, because my only priority then was to make sure that we got as many women using period products as possible. But I guess through the years, the understanding has always been now is that not every kind of product is suitable for every community around the world. So as much as disposable products might be cheaper in places like the Gambia, is that really better for them long term? Because they still have to buy the product every month, for example, right? Or they don't have places where it can be discarded safely. So we're an organization that will always look at how the community is, what their beliefs are. Not all communities will accept a menstrual cup because of the insertion. There isn't always water to clean products. If there's a reusable pad and there's a country that doesn't have too much sunlight, does that mean it's going to work in terms of sterilizing the pad? So we have to think about different considerations, and mostly I would say it's about affordability and about availability. So if we were going to launch a reusable product in the Gambia, we'd have to look at sourcing local fabric and local materials, because it's not effective to bring in products from another country. It just adds again to this idea of what are we doing to save the planet. And I would say that the next generation is far more savvy around that conversation and open to having more planet-friendly products than perhaps we were while we were growing up. But then in places like India and Africa, they're kind of behind us, I would say, by about 20 years, and they want to have disposable products. Even though we could teach them how to wash and reuse their rags safely, for example, they want to get to the point where they're able to use disposable products. So there's a lot of conversation around changing the way that we think about our periods and the products that we use. But I think that everybody has the right to use what's best for them.
Yeah, definitely. I think as well, it's this was spoken about a lot at COP, and this idea that, you know, you can't expect the entire globe to change at the same time. So for instance, like you said, in parts of Africa and India, if they are in the position where actually the disposable ones are the most appropriate to use at the moment, then that is the case. Again, at the end of the day, like you said, that period dignity is kind of the forefront, but, you know, it's then maybe, like I said, our position in these more developed countries where we've got more choices and we've got more access to these sustainable products, and actually the availability to wash them very safely and understand how to use them a little bit better in terms of, you know, just instructions and the access to them. I think that, you know, that is maybe something that we ask ourselves is, all of these products we've used before and this kind of history we've got attached to them, that maybe that is something we take on ourselves. If there isn't an education out there, then we make sure that that's something we at least trial ourselves, and looking at, you know, Moon Cup and all of these other kind of brands that are a little bit more locally sourced. But yeah, no, that's really interesting. I don't know if Ria had a question. Yeah.
Yeah, I did. I had another one. It was just on the same basis of this whole idea of sustainability, because I remember when I was younger and we were being taught about female reproductive health, and the Moon Cup was kind of brought out, but it looked really old. And I think it was almost as if they were swaying away, and they were saying like, oh, this is what they used in the 60s, but now this is what we use. And I remember from the get-go, I was like, oh my God, I would never use that. I would never put that up there. And then I think now, having these conversations, I realized that it obviously is far more sustainable than it can look. It's almost like the way it looks as well. It has to look pretty almost if it's going to go like near your vagina, in your vagina, really. And the question that I had after that long-winded story was, with sustainable products, I was just wondering how many times you can actually use them, because I've done me and Bethan have done a bit of research on the period panties. And after doing that, I was just wondering, like, how many times can you wash them, and how long will it actually be hygienic for? And does it just elongate the time that you have to throw it away? Or, that's just what I was wondering.
So a great question. Thanks, Ria. because you're right, what does sustainability actually mean? It means different things to different people. And a menstrual cup, for example, is made from silicone, and my understanding is it lasts up to 4 years. But the downside of it might be, well, how many do you need? Do you have two? Do you sterilize one and then, or because we have to remember how we are as girls. Not all of us are that well planned that if we had reusable pads, for example, that we're going to make sure that they're used, washed, used, washed, used, washed, used, washed, dried, used, washed, dried. So one packet of reusable pads is probably not going to work for us. We might need 2 or 3, and then I would say that reusable pads are a little bit like socks. They disappear in the washing machine. So how does that impact that sustainability idea? Or does sustainability mean that we're no longer throwing things in the bin? So for example, sometimes we speak to girls who'll say that they use a disposable pad and they wrap it in the plastic and then they wrap it in tissue paper before they throw it away. Now, that just makes it even worse. And the reason they're doing that is because of the shame and the stigma. So your question around period underwear, sometimes the manufacturers might say it lasts up to 3 years, but it depends on how you wash them. So if you're hand washing them, is that going to make the product last as long as if you wash them in the machine? And then how do you dry them? So varying, and I guess you have to consider each product as it comes. I know that the product that we launched, a reusable pad, is antibacterial properties it has, and the lab said that it would last up to 3 years. But again, I would say it depends on how you wash them. The detergent that you might use, whether you use soap, whether you stick it on a radiator. Sometimes people iron pads, and I know that ironing them is not going to really dry them from inside. So the best way to dry up anything that you put between your legs for your period is natural sunlight, because sunlight is it sterilizes things. And how many of us around the world want to show a rag and put it in the sunlight on a washing line? So we have to teach girls how to dry that without feeling embarrassed and ashamed. So they're great questions. And I think when we think about sustainability and we look at each community and each person, what they feel and what they think and how much money they have and what's the most important thing to them about their period, and understanding what it is, we have to kind of create a bespoke solution for individuals.
Great, thank you. No, fab. Does anyone else have any questions as well they'd like to ask, or if they want to drop it in the chat? But one of the kind of questions, while people I'm sure are thinking of all of their questions, is looking at kind of as well, I don't know if this is something obviously you might not do, but other organisations, obviously, people who menstruate who are refugees or homeless and stuff. So like you said, with these sustainable products, they're almost not necessarily not a choice, but they're a lot harder for these women to use, because again, there isn't this opportunity to wash them if they haven't got access to clean water. I know that some of the work you did was in the Gambia was actually then building these wells so that the women could then wash the products as well. But what's kind of the protocol then again with refugees, if there is any, or is it a situation where no one's really addressed this yet, that there are people who are menstruating who are homeless and are refugees, and old young girls who are starting their period while they're crossing borders effectively? But
yeah, I would say that again, because we look at work based on communities, I think there's many governments around the world or organizations around the world who'll say, oh yeah, we donated period products to this school. But what they did was they might have given them a packet of disposable pads. And I think that's quite evil, because what you're doing is you're letting young girls use something that they most likely don't know how to use properly, but then they're just having a little taster. And then what about the rest of the time, right? So if you are going to provide anything for a community, whether it's a homeless or refugee or a school, you've got to make sure that you understand what they're using currently, and then you give them something that either they've been given education about so that they're using it properly, or you give them an adequate supply, because the adequate supply is equally as important as teaching them how to use the product. So I think menstrual cups have kind of, well, maybe it seems to me that they're doing this, they're going up in that conversation because we're in it all the time. But most people don't know how to use it. Most people don't know how to insert it safely and how to wash it. And in fact, some people have never even heard of it. So I think sometimes other things to consider are that homeless women, for example, they've got so many other issues. Do we really want to suggest that they use a reusable product when they don't have access to water, or they can't really use toilets frequently, or they don't feel safe going into public bathrooms? Or do we just give them enough disposable products so they never have to worry about their period? Is that how we do it? So those are the things to consider when you're working with different communities, because again, the refugees, they have so many other issues that they have to work through on a day-to-day basis. Converting them to sustainable products might not be the best idea. However, if they want to learn how to use the product and they have access to water and they feel comfortable having that discussion, then I would always start with that sustainable method to make their lives easier.
Yeah, brilliant. No, I agree. I do think from conversations I've had, it is something that people are a lot more open to now, is trying these new products. But I think when people are in their 20s, they're like, I've just gotten to grips of what my period is doing, or kind of how often I have it, or if you're on birth control, getting used to kind of what now your new period looks like, etc. So I think it's a position of then, I don't want to try something foreign in my body again. And I think it is checking yourself and reminding yourself of the opportunity you do have this access to water, and actually trying to maybe be a little bit more environmentally conscious, and checking, I guess, our privileges of actually, we aren't homeless, we have got access to something, we can clean these products in, and we have maybe the money to buy them.
I would say that privilege that we have, sometimes we don't realize that just because we don't have menstrual pain, for example, doesn't mean someone else doesn't. Or just because we can't get out, that we don't have any problem getting out of bed. Some girls cannot get out of bed, or some girls will always leak through their product, and maybe they haven't been taught that they either need to change more frequently, or that there's a better product out there for them. So we have to remember that what we know isn't necessarily what someone else knows, and maybe we're able to deal with our period much better than other people, but that doesn't mean that other people don't suffer with it. And again, this idea of shame, just because we don't have shame, or we perceive we don't have shame, but then we might still be sitting in a cafe talking about periods, still whispering the word period and thinking we don't have shame, but we do. So it's try it, have a conversation with someone else, ask them to explain what a period is. And then when you start that conversation, you suddenly realize how little we actually do know about it. And then you could ask them, well, what products do you use? What day of your cycle are you on? When is the time that you might ovulate in a month? Check in, because we do this because it's important to understand what we don't know, so that we can then teach it, rather than what we do know. Because we all know how to handle our cycles, but the reality is most of us don't know everything about menstruation, and there's so much to talk about it. Even things like, for example, which we haven't covered, is training, right? If we're a sports child, when's the best time in the cycle to train, and when is the good time to have a match? Are our trainers working with us to understand where we are in our cycle? Do we use pain relief, or do we find other methods of handling our menstrual pain and uncomfort? Or do we use medication and we go to paracetamol straight away? In places like Africa and India, we don't recommend using medication, because we know that the affordability is an issue with health. So we always look at alternate methods and look at what they're currently using as a way of pain relief, and then sharing those ideas.
Yeah, no, I and it's something I want to speak to Mandeep more about, who's the president of the Sikh Games, and kind of navigating through I guess Olympians and stuff. And my boyfriend would love that I'm speaking about it, but there's a lot of conversations around with female footballers at the moment, and actually what this means, and something that he has mentioned a lot, that is female footballers are seen very much as male footballers, but with, long hair. And actually how it's really different is obviously they, like you said, how they train is very different because their bodies are different. And like I said before, with this to-do list you have, your energy is so different. That again comes into maybe your postpartum, you've just had a child, your body is so different, your kind of hormones, and actually, if you're Olympian during their menopause, or if it's an early menopause, which, stems to the further conversation. But, going back to periods, that is something that, this lack of education that women have, let alone then the wider community, is so important, because it does completely change. And actually, it does highlight this hegemon and this kind of idea that a lot of things are written with men in mind, whether it's come to kind of however the rules are done or whatever it is. And a lot of podcasts talk about toilets, for instance, and actually they aren't hygienic enough even in the UK. If you're obviously dealing with blood effectively, there should be a lot of products in the toilet itself to make sure it's more hygienic. So I think, that is a really interesting conversation about, women in sports, and actually that should be one of the most kind of encouraged conversations to have, is the role their menstrual cycle rather has on their performance, and when their games are, and kind of if they play, or if it's not worth them playing, for instance. I'll pass over to Davina as well, if you want to turn on your mic.
Yes, so I just had a quick query. With these sustainable products, I'm sure like all of us grew up not knowing about them, and it's more of a new sudden thing. And obviously with young people in schools, they're going to be taught probably about these products, so they're going to be aware of them. But how do we start to become aware of them and normalize it and educate ourselves? Obviously now we're no longer in those education systems where we obviously, it's kind of, I'm sure a lot of us are environmentally minded, and obviously I would like to probably use sustainable products, but how do we teach ourselves? How do we normalize it and make it more mainstream and less taboo and scary?
Again, Davina, that's a great question, and I guess it's through education in schools, but also if we look at the big manufacturers. So, for example, I believe Procter & Gamble, they've now launched period underwear. Some of the retailers, I can't remember the name now, but some of the bigger retailers have also launched period underwear. And I would say that it might take a long time before they are actually advertising about it. So I don't know if you guys know this, but for example, the Samaritans came about because a young girl, when she first started her cycle, thought she had a terminal illness and she committed suicide. And the guy that performed her funeral is the chap that started the Samaritans. So it's a story that isn't really talked about. And I guess the story isn't talked about because it's menstruation. And that's the sad thing. We have an opportunity to normalize the discussion, but are we using every resource available to get that conversation in mainstream? So Davina, what I would say is that you either work with charities like ourselves so that we can get the message out into the community at large. So for example, with Surrey County Council, it wasn't just about the provision of period products. What they're doing with us is they are helping us to eradicate the stigma and the shame by utilizing the campaign that we have, where we're putting stickers up in public spaces. So, for example, if you go into a shop, you might see a Visa sticker or a MasterCard sticker or Amex, that card is acceptable in those premises. We have stickers up in all of the locations that say menstrual products are available here. And that's how we're working with the community at large. In places like India and Africa, we go into communities and we provide workshops. In the UK, we have menstrual health workshops for organizations which cover menstruation, but also we talk about the menopause. So I guess it's just getting involved and perhaps even talking about periods in your own family. Or have you ever talked about periods with your dad or your brother or even your mother, and normalizing it at that level and encouraging them to go out and talk about periods? I guess these are the ways that I would suggest getting that conversation out there more so. And in fact, as Beth is doing today, getting on Zoom calls, I know that when we get a group of 10 or 12 girls or women together, it's almost like we're opening a Pandora box, because we all have good, bad, and ugly period stories, and we've never really talked about them. And it's really quite exciting when we do talk about them, because it just helps us understand that there's so many parallels with other people, and that we're not alone, and that we do share the same embarrassment and the same stigma and the taboo. And I guess one of the things that what we discovered was that the most embarrassing thing, doesn't matter where we are in the world, is this fear of leaking. And leaking through our clothing is that thing that we would like to eliminate the most.
I think as well, on the Binti Period Instagram today, they had the cartoon of Aladdin and Jasmine, and it was obviously a photo of kind of her, but also leaking onto the mat. And it's obviously funny, but I think where that's really interesting as well is, like you said, there is no exposure to women menstruating in films, especially at Disney level, like, or any kind of kids film. It's this lack of representation of women as an entire kind of compass. And actually, from what my kind of opinion is, that if any kind of film is shown where they then show a young girl kind of menstruating, it's just kind of her reaction to it is terrifying, and there's not really then another conversation from that, which no, I agree. I think it's really interesting.
I mean, imagine if David Attenborough did a TV series about menstruation. Like, it would change the conversation overnight, because he would make it sound so sexy and divine, and it would be so factual and so thought-provoking. I mean, I cannot wait one day to be in front of him and say, this is what we have to do. Because I think it'll be people like him that create that massive change in society and normalize that whole thing and make menstruation really the most exciting thing to talk about. And for me, I would say it is, because I'm doing what I love, traveling around the world, going into far corners and going into communities that are Islamic, for example. I would be terrified in a normal world, but 10 days ago, I was unpicking their idea and belief about Islam, not because I was trying to provoke any anger or anything, but it was just to get them to come out of this mindset that everything that they know is exactly how it is. How do you forget what your belief patterns are and be open to change? And it was the maddest, wildest thing that I ever did. But I guess it was just the confidence and that belief that that obviously I knew what I was talking about, but also that it was done with that big respect, by being in part of their community and getting them to believe that once they are able to eradicate that stigma from their own lives, they'll be able to talk about anything. And that was kind of my cool experience.
No, that is amazing. And we will try and get David Attenborough on for next week. If we do another one, I'm sure he'll be free. We had one question which also kind of links to, I guess, my last question. The question from Georgia was, so how do you navigate people gaslighting your period? So are there any tactics that you can suggest? And my question kind of was, similar enough, was to close kind of the webinar, what's your advice for those who menstruate and those who don't when it comes to educating and ensuring that we do strive for period dignity? So similar question.
Yeah, there's so many, I guess, but so as an organization, we don't use bad language when we talk about periods. We don't really look at the humor around PMS, because we have to kind of keep it really clean, because just so that we can create education that is based on dignity and respect. And ultimately, we know, for example, that there's shame at the beginning when we start our periods, and there's shame at the end when we go through the menopause. And the fact that this shame throws us away from understanding our bodies or knowing what is normal, there's just no space for it, right? So it's really important. When we first started off and we looked at the language that we wanted to use, these were the considerations that we had. Like, what does it actually mean if you don't have access to period product, or you can't afford it, or you don't even know what your period is? And the word dignity came up several times. But like, for example, this term period poverty, it's a terrible term, and we always steer away from it, because what it does is it reinforces further stigma. If you don't have access to food or water, or you can't buy clothes, we don't say we don't highlight the children in school, for example, that can't afford lunches, right? We stay away from labeling the kids that are on school meals. We learnt that a long time ago, and I think that's important to also consider for menstruation, is that if you can't afford period products, let's not use the word period poverty, because it just reinforces further stigma and shame. So dignity to us means that you understand how your period works, you're not ashamed of it, you've got adequate access to managing your cycle, and you're almost proud of the fact that you are menstruating, because it's giving you a clear signal of good health, or you know where you are with your health. So yeah, that's, I would say, my final word on it.
That was yeah, very insightful way of closing. Thank you. Yeah, does anyone have any last questions? No. What I'm going to do here as well is pop in the chat, so the link to the Gambia Fund for Binti Period, so as she was talking about kind of the work she's done, so yeah, to help kind of roll out this education in Gambia, and hopefully then help them do work elsewhere as well. And it's also got both the Instagram handles too. But no, thank you so much. And yeah, if anyone does have questions that they don't want to ask now, then they can always kind of drop me a message. I'll stay on for a little bit as well, and I can kind of, we can address them some other way, I'm sure. But thank you so much for everyone who joined and for stayed the whole nearly hour and a half. That was really good to see such a good turnout. One thing I was going to mention at the end as well is, so with Sikh Human Rights Group, with the kind of female empowerment series we're doing, but also with our COP work we've done and other stuff, we are looking kind of for interns and volunteers as well. So if you want to message me kind of privately on this, your email address, then I can kind of reach out to you with the information. But otherwise, thank you very much, Manjit, and everyone who joined. I don't know if you've got anything else you want to say.
I was just going to say that this audience was very quiet. In fact, they're quieter than the 16-year-olds I had last week. So I am going to share my email address. If anybody has any questions that they'd like to ask, or if you would like to have a menstrual health workshop in your workplace or in your community, whether it's in school, I don't know where everybody's from, but I've sent you my email address. And if you would like to follow us, then if you go to our website, it's just there. Well, again, like Bethan said, we're always looking for volunteers as well as an organization and support. So please do get in touch.
They've also got a great app as well, so if you want to download that. But yeah, thank you so much for everyone who joined. Like I said, drop me your email address and note down the other information in the chat. But thank you and have a great evening. Our next one is in 2 weeks. It's on contraception, so that's with founder of Core Health. So we'll be talking about all different types of contraception, and you know, the more natural ones, the more hormonal ones as well. So yeah, thanks very much, everyone. Have a great Monday.
Thank you.
Really quiet. Thanks, Manjit. Bye.
That was a very quiet bunch of people.